you very much. Thank you for asking me to come and speak on this topic here. I feel a bit bad because so many of you are standing, and I'm not sure that you would have the energy to stand through a whole lecture. It would be good if you could just find some comfortable places to sit. Before I talk about the Indian trade deal, particularly with the United States, I would like to spend some time discussing what exactly Trump stands for. Why is it that there is now a new stance as far as imperialism is concerned vis-a-vis the rest of the world? Okay. Now, there is a view, particularly in American liberal circles, that this Trump is a crazy fellow, that basically he is a maverick and he is actually changing a rule-based international order of the kind we used to have earlier, and like a bull in a china shop, he is actually disrupting all kinds of relations and all kinds of established rules and patterns and so on. I believe that is not a correct position. It's not a correct position in the sense that, after all, the American people elected Trump. So the question when you ask about Trump's madness or Trump's idiosyncrasy, the question is, why did the American people elect an idiosyncratic person like Trump? In other words, just as kingship is a relationship between people, Trumpism too is something which is really a relationship between people. It is in fact expressive of a certain socio-economic conjuncture. What is that conjuncture that actually brings a man like Trump to power and makes him pursue the kind of policies which he has been pursuing? So I'd like to devote some time to that before I move on to any discussion of India. Now, I think there are two features of the contemporary world capitalism which we have to note. Both these features, while they relate to world capitalism as a whole, are features which I would like to discuss in the context of the United States. The first feature is that all over the world there is an extreme depression in the share of workers in the total output or in the total value added. In other words, the share of workers in the total income that is generated has been falling all over the world. Certainly, this is true not only of the global south, this is not only true of India. As you know, the Paris-based World Inequality Database says that now the top 1% of India's population controls a higher share of national income than at any time in the last 100 years. Just now, my wife and colleague Prabhat Patnaik has just written a book called Exploring the Poverty Question, in which she actually shows that poverty in India, particularly starting from 1991, has been increasing when poverty is defined in nutritional terms to denote access to certain amount of calories per person per day. But it's not just a matter relating to India. All over the world, there is an enormous rise in the share of surplus. Therefore, there is a corresponding fall in the share of wages. And the reason for this is not very difficult to fathom, because what has happened with globalization is that now, even though labor is not mobile across countries, capital now is mobile. In other words, now American capital invests in China, in Indonesia, in India, in Bangladesh, wherever. So if capital is mobile, then it weakens the trade union movement, which is organized on a national basis. If it is the case that the American workers decide to go on strike demanding higher wages, then the American capitalists say, all right, you are demanding higher wages, we are going to Bangladesh. We'll now invest our money in Bangladesh, setting up a plant there and so on. Therefore, the wages in the advanced countries get tied down by the huge labor reserves that exist in countries like ours, which keep our wages close to a subsistence level. Because of this, as a matter of fact, Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, has made a calculation that the average wage of a male American worker in 2011 was marginally lower in absolute terms compared to 1968. So obviously all over the world you find that the share of workers is falling. In fact, in many ways, the share of workers is falling to a degree where the absolute level of income itself is less than it was some time ago in real terms. Now, obviously, productivity is increasing. If labor productivity is increasing, so if the wages are not rising, labor productivity is increasing, that means the share of surplus in output is rising rapidly. There is, in other words, a redistribution of income from wages to surplus. Now, if you give a rupee of wage to a worker, the worker would probably consume the entire rupee. But if you give a rupee of wage to a rich man, then the rich man would probably consume about 50 paise out of it and keep the remaining 50 in the pocket, saying, I'll spend it tomorrow. Now, economists use the word saving to denote that which is not consumed. Therefore, the proportion of savings out of unit income for the better off people, for the rich people, is higher than for the working people. Therefore, any such redistribution of income which is taking place from the workers to the capitalists and to the surplus, those to whom the surplus accrues, economic surplus, is a redistribution that necessarily reduces the level of aggregate demand. And therefore, that necessarily reduces output and increases unemployment. This, therefore, is an addition. You see, on the one hand, wages don't rise. On the other hand, because wages don't rise, you find that consumption does not rise together with income exactly at the same rate, and because of which you find that output itself tends to slow down, output growth, and therefore unemployment increases. That is one part of it. In the United States, even though official data do not show an increase in unemployment, the actual increase in unemployment is significant because the participation rates, labor force participation rates, have come down greatly. In other words, people don't kind of, count themselves as looking for jobs because there are very few jobs around. So invariably, therefore, the reduction in labor force participation rate is symptomatic of a rise in unemployment rate, even though the official unemployment rate may not be showing as rapid an increase. So the first situation, when you look at the United States, is not only a lowering of the level of real wages, certainly a lowering of the shares, but what is more, a greater unemployment among the workers. The second aspect that you find in the United States is that if you look at the entire Second World War period, post-Second World War period, unlike in the earlier period, there are no colonies. In other words, you now have a situation where you have capitalism without colonies. You in fact have imperialism without colonies. What it means, I'll discuss in a moment. Now, if you don't have colonies, then the colony has two advantages for capitalism. One is that the colony provides a captive market. That basically you can sell your goods which you can't sell anywhere else in the colony. The second is that a lot of the raw materials which are available in the colonies are raw materials that the metropolitan country appropriates on its own, sells and takes away the revenue, which is what Indian nationalist writers call the drain of surplus. That basically there is a unilateral transfer of wealth from the colony to the metropolis, and the wealth takes the physical form of the sale of raw materials in the international market. Okay, so these two advantages which colonialism had given to metropolitan capitalism in the earlier period are not available at the moment in the post-Second World War period. Now, this has had a very important implication. That implication is that the United States, you see, when you are a leading capitalist country like the United States or like Britain earlier, the leading capitalist country necessarily runs what economists call a current account deficit in the balance of payments. Why? You have to maintain bases all over the world. They have 1,900 bases all over the world you have to spend for them, etc. So you actually have a current account deficit. But of course, if you have a current account deficit, for America there is no problem, because the dollar is a world's reserve currency. It can simply print dollars. You see, if India has a current account deficit, India has to borrow in the international market, borrow dollars in the international market to meet that deficit. But on the other hand, the United States can just print dollars to meet that deficit. So a problem has not arisen for the US in a direct sense. But on the other hand, this has meant that the world is awash with dollars. There is plenty of dollars now floating around the world. China's reserves are in dollars. India, even though India has no current account surplus, India has borrowed money and is holding on to reserves in dollars. You have a European Union, which has a current account surplus in dollars. So the world is, and of course the oil countries, oil producing countries. So the world is awash with dollars. Because of which you now find a peculiar situation where the world's mightiest country, the world's richest country, the world's most powerful country is also the one which is most indebted. It's most in debt, because if I hold a dollar, then I hold an IOU of the US government or of the US central bank. Therefore, every dollar I hold is a debt of the United States. So if the world is awash with dollars, that basically means the United States is really indebted to the entire world in huge amounts. Now, this is a very new situation in capitalism. In the pre-First World War capitalism, which is when Britain's hegemony was unquestioned, the interwar period was one which was really kind of, a bit of a mixture, because there are all kinds of instabilities there, at that time, depression and so on. But the pre-First World War period, which is when British hegemony was, British supremacy and the supremacy of pound sterling was unquestioned, in that particular period, even though Britain was the most powerful country, it never got indebted. On the contrary, it actually made capital exports. How was that possible? It was possible because of the fact of British colonialism. That the colonies like India, for instance, not only were captive markets where British goods could be sold to the extent they liked, and what is more, it also was a place from where there was a significant drain of wealth from Britain to from India to Britain. So you can see, for instance, that if you look at the total British balance of payment deficit, both capital and current account, vis-a-vis continental Europe and the United States, in 1910 that came to about $90 million. Britain's drain from India, including of course British sale of textiles to India, came to $60 million. So about 2/3 of Britain's payments deficit vis-a-vis other advanced capitalist countries was met by what Britain sucked out of India. Now the point is that is not available to the United States. Now that has been a feature, but that is a feature which is actually pregnant with the possibility of financial instability. Okay, with financial instability. Any moment, suppose imagine tomorrow, somebody decides that, look, we have had too many dollars, we should now move to some other way of holding our wealth.
in that case, the price of dollar would fall, the price of that other asset would increase, and therefore you would have, and if the price of dollar falls, you would have an enormous jolt to the financial stability of the capitalist world. Okay? Now, this is really a very serious problem. When this problem is raised, sometimes the answer that is given is that, look, there is no other currency that is really anywhere near the dollar. The answer that is given is that suppose the Chinese decided to move away from dollar, but in that case the price of dollar falls. But since they already have so much dollars, the price of dollar falling basically means that they would lose their wealth. Because of which the argument is that no country can really move out of dollars to any other currency. As a matter of fact, however, that is not true, because while they may not be able to move to some other currency, they can move to commodities, they can move to gold, they can move to oil, they can hoard oil, they can hoard all kinds of raw materials. If so, then there would be an enormous increase in the price of this raw material, and that would mean an enormous rate of inflation, and that itself is something which would be a big jolt to the capitalist, world capitalist system. Such a thing is not just a matter of conjecture. This actually happened in 1971. In 1971, there was all over the world, for some reason, a shift from dollar to commodities. It was actually triggered by the fact that de Gaulle and others wanted to, dollar was convertible to gold. They suddenly said, look, we don't want to hold dollars, give us gold. There was not that much gold at that time, and therefore the dollar price started falling vis-a-vis gold. And when that happens, they moved to, world's wealth holders moved to commodities. There was a huge inflation in 1971. Now, that kind of an inflation, typically the capitalist way of ending that kind of an inflation is by generating unemployment, is by reducing the level of demand in the economy, adopting what is called austerity measures. So the adoption of austerity measures would basically mean a cut in government spending, a cut especially in government's welfare spending, a cut, a rise in unemployment, and a cut in wage bills everywhere, and so on. This is exactly what people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan had done when the 1970s inflation had taken place. But on the other hand, that was something which was occurring at a time when the working class had been rather doing well because of the post-war boom. But I have said that already the working class in America and elsewhere is very badly squeezed at the moment because of a combination of reduced share in income, reduced wages in absolute terms in many countries, and higher unemployment. And any austerity at this moment is something that would actually make the condition of the working class so bad that you would actually have social revolt spreading all over the capitalist world. Therefore, the capitalist world today, and this is certainly true of the United States, is now in a very delicate, fragile situation where the social stability that is required for a system to continue is under very serious and grave threat. How is this threat being sought to be met? There are two ways in which it is being sought to be met. One, of course, is through fascism. Trump himself is really an expression of a kind of fascism which is flourishing in the United States. You create divisions between immigrants and the local population, you create divisions between blacks and whites, you create division between Mexicans and Americans, and so on. So one is fascism. And fascism is very repressive, as you know, in America, as indeed here. There is an enormous attack on the universities everywhere in the United States. I mean, universities like Columbia, Harvard, and so on have been facing a very difficult time because of the Trump administration. Okay, so one is, of course, fascism. The second is this idea that, look, if colonies help us in introducing a semblance of financial stability, why don't we get hold of some colonies? And therefore there is an attempt at recolonization. And this is something that Trump stands for. Many of you would have seen Marco Rubio's speech, he is the Secretary of State, to European leaders, in which he actually says that, look, Western, and they don't say capitalism, he says Western civilization is under threat because of the fact that under the impact of communism, there is this national liberation movement that got going, because of which the colonial empires actually were lost to Western civilization, and this is something which has dealt a debilitating blow to Western civilization, and we should negate this blow, which basically means that we should reacquire the colonial empires. So that there is a very clear attempt at recolonization, which would take the form, again, whether or not politically recolonizing is not the matter, is not a great concern. Not that they would send viceroys to rule here, but in economic terms, acquiring captive markets, acquiring control over raw materials which you can sell as your own goods. After all, when Trump takes over Venezuela, and Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, in effect he's taking over Venezuelan oil. Similarly, when Trump claims that Greenland should be a part of the United States, Greenland has a number of very rich raw materials, therefore he's laying claim to Greenland's raw materials. That's one aspect of colonialism. The other is, of course, the kind of treaties that he has signed. No, not yet. I mean, the Indo-US trade treaty is one expression of this kind of an economic recolonization, the loss of sovereignty on the part of India, and India, of course, has been a very typical case in which this has been rammed through. This treaty, the Indo-US trade treaty, has to be seen in the context of this, in the context of this overall problem that capitalism is currently facing, particularly the leading capitalist country, the United States, and its attempt to acquire captive markets and its attempt to acquire raw materials and a part of these raw materials gratis. In other words, you take over these raw materials and so on as your own goods and sell them and appropriate the proceeds. Now, there are at least, okay, I know that the details of the Indo-US trade treaty have not yet been made public, but whatever we know, there are three very clear instances in which the fact that this is an unequal treaty is something which is manifest. By an unequal treaty, I mean a treaty not between two sovereign nations. The first instance is the American insistence that you have to buy oil not from Russia, but you have to buy oil from us. Now, American oil is much more expensive than Russian oil. If Russian oil imports are substituted by American oil imports, in that case, altogether it is going to be $10 to $12 billion every year that India has to cough up. Okay. Now, this is something which, and this is a figure which not many newspapers in India talk about, but London's Guardian has actually estimated that India's loss would be $10 to $12 billion every year. Now, no sovereign nation tells another sovereign nation to buy its goods even though they are more expensive. A sovereign nation has the freedom to buy goods wherever it finds convenient, wherever they are cheaper and so on. So to ask a sovereign nation, to compel a sovereign nation to buy goods from you even though they are more expensive, is really one very clear instance of an unequal treaty. The second instance is the insistence that India must buy over the next 5 years $500 billion of American goods. India must import $500 billion worth of American goods. Now the point is, so obviously it means roughly $100 billion every year. Currently, our total imports from the United States every year is $40 billion, 40 to 45. Therefore, we are actually visualizing a sudden jump from 40 to $100 billion. And this is not as if it's a bilateral agreement. I mean, in the sense that it is not a reciprocal thing. Not that the Americans are promising to buy from us a certain minimum amount. We are promising to buy from the Americans $100 billion all of a sudden, which means 2.5 times what we normally have been buying from them. Where we are going to get the foreign exchange to buy these goods, what goods we are going to buy, whether we need these goods, and so on, are matters which are not discussed at all. But this is something which is a compulsion which Trump has imposed on the Indian government, that they must buy $100 billion on average per year of American goods. The third instance, Trump has complained that till now, we actually, that America was being discriminated against in its trade with India. Why? Because America allowed a lot of Indian imports duty-free. But India imposed large amount of duty on American imports, I mean imports of American goods. All right. Let us accept the argument. If this unfairness had to be addressed, if this unfairness had to be done away with, then we could have had a fair trade. But what has actually happened is really a complete reversal of it. A complete reversal where now Indian goods would be entering the market at a minimum of 18% duty, while American goods would be entering the Indian market at 0 duty. So we now have a flipping whereby, by Trump's own claims, what was happening earlier would be exactly reversed, which basically means that if the earlier arrangement was against the United States, the new arrangement would be against India. Now these are the kinds of things which no sovereign country accepts, and no sovereign country has either the right or normally the capacity to impose upon another sovereign country. But these are features of the Indo-US trade treaty. Now this trade treaty, naturally Trump has said very good, and so on. Modi is my friend, the great statesman and so on. Trump is naturally going to praise an Indian government that signs a treaty of this kind. That in turn is used as an argument in India to show, you see, Trump is saying how great we are, and therefore this must be very good and we must be really great for Trump to be saying this. But that's ridiculous. The argument which is often put forward, the argument put forward is the following: that a lot of the goods which we are now going to import duty free are goods which go in as animal feed. For instance, DDG, red sorghum, and so on. All these are goods which are used as animal feed. Now, if we bring those inputs at 0 duty, then our cost of animal feed would actually go down. If the cost of animal feed goes down, in that case it's good for the farmers. So the argument is that as far as the farmers are concerned, you people are saying the farmers are going to suffer. On the contrary, what is going to happen is really the farmers would be much better off, because after all, farmers also, animal husbandry is a part of farming, and therefore the farmers would also be better off because of cheaper inputs. If the idea was getting cheaper inputs or if the idea was to cheapen the inputs for Indian farmers, you don't actually have to import things. You can cheapen the inputs for Indian farmers by simply giving a fiscal subsidy. After all, a lot of American farmers, in fact, the whole of American farming, indeed European Union farming, is heavily subsidized by the governments. In some years, the total subsidy, cash subsidy given by the United States government to their farmers is as much as 1/2 of the total value of agricultural production. So it's a huge amount of, and exactly the same is true of the European Union. Therefore, if we wanted cheaper inputs for our farmers in order to promote animal husbandry production, then there is no reason why domestic production of feed should be destroyed. You can actually have domestic production of feed, expanding domestic production of feed, but provide a fiscal subsidy. The fact that this is not done, the fact that imports are being allowed, which would destroy the domestic production of animal feed, is really something which is against the interests of the farmers, because then they are going to lose out as far as income is concerned, as far as employment is concerned. You see, whenever we have a duty, an import duty, that is obviously expressive of the fact that the foreign good is cheaper than the domestic good. If the foreign good was not cheaper than the domestic good, why should we have a duty? Then you allow it because they would not be able to compete with our domestic producers if they were not cheaper. It is only when they are cheaper that we protect our domestic producers. Why do we protect our domestic producers? We protect because their incomes go up, employment goes up, they spend these incomes on buying all kinds of other goods, therefore incomes go up. There in the secondary and tertiary activities, employment goes up in secondary and tertiary activities. Therefore, you have what is called a multiplier effect, and therefore domestic employment and income on the whole is much larger. So the whole logic of protection is not to buy cheap goods. The whole logic of protection is to, in fact, even though it may be more expensive, the whole logic of protection is to have protection in order to generate larger employment and larger output. That's why Trump is having protection, because Trump's protection is meant to increase employment in America at a time when, as I said, unemployment in the US has been rising. So the whole idea that it will become cheaper, animal feed would become cheaper, therefore let us allow imports of animal feed even at the expense of domestic production, is an idea which is completely without any basis. Sometimes the argument is put forward that, look, we are now with this Indo-US treaty going to open up a market of $30 trillion. Day before yesterday, I was speaking along with a student of mine, former student, and he was saying, I don't know where they get this $30 trillion. $30 trillion is actually the US GDP. So it amounts to saying that the whole of the American GDP, the whole of the American turnover, the whole of the American market is something now that will fall to India. Now this is ridiculous. We can get only a fraction of it. The fact that $30 trillion constitute the US turnover is something which is not very relevant on here, because on that basis, any trade treaty, any free trade agreement with any large country would be justifiable, which is nonsense. So all the arguments put forward really are arguments that do not carry any conviction. This is, as I mentioned, an unequal treaty, and that being the case, it's very important that we prevent the harm coming to the Indian farmers in particular from this unequal treaty. Take a very simple case, cotton for instance. Now, in anticipation of reduced cotton prices, in India the cotton market has already become depressed. Now, the fact, and let us be very clear, that cotton farmers have been among the most important victims of the suicides which have been happening, 3 lakh, 4 lakh farmers committing suicide in the last 3-4 decades. Now, cotton farmers have been the worst victims of this. If you allow free import of cotton, then obviously you're going to hurt the Indian cotton farmers. And these free imports are really imports which are cheaper because of the fact that there are huge subsidies given by the American government. The American government today gives on average to every single cotton farmer 1 crore of rupees as subsidy, as simply income transfer. So, but there are only 27,000 cotton farmers in the United States, each of course cultivating a huge area, but only 27,000 cotton farmers, so they get 27,000 crores of rupees, which for the US government is peanuts. But the point is that imagine 1 crore per farmer, and that is now being used as an argument for cheapening the import of raw cotton into India, and that is something which is going to hurt the Indian cotton farmers very badly, and they have already, as I said, been the victims of the spate of suicides which have been taking place over the last 3-4 decades. Fortunately, the US Supreme Court has come down on Trump, saying that, look, you have no business to be imposing tariffs. You remember, that whole Boston Tea Party and so on, no taxation without representation, and therefore a tariff being like a tax, a tariff can be imposed where the people are represented, that is by the Congress. The American Constitution says that imposing tariffs or tariff policies is a decision of the Congress. What the president can do is that the president can impose maximum up to 15% tariff for a certain period until it is ratified by the Congress or rejected by the Congress. Therefore, the president is allowed only some interim power, and that too to the maximum extent of 15%. This Trump's business of saying I'm going to impose 50% on India or 100% or 200%, all that is something which is unconstitutional according to the US Supreme Court. Because of which now the arm twisting which Trump had engaged in vis-a-vis India, saying that, look, if you don't do this, then if you buy Russian oil, we're going to impose 25% tariffs on goods from you, and additional 25% tariff over and above the 25% tariff we are imposing on you anyway. The proposal that if you don't buy oil from, if you buy oil from America, we are going to put an additional 25% tariff on you, is something which is really unconstitutional according to the American Constitution and according as interpreted by the American Supreme Court. Now, this gives us an opportunity to come out of this Indo-US trade deal, to simply not negotiate with Trump anymore, and to get rid of this entire unequal treaty. Whether the Modi government would do it or not is something which remains to be seen, but this is a golden opportunity which is handed over to the Modi government. Of course, the US trade deal is one part of the story, but in addition, India has been signing a whole lot of free trade agreements with all kinds of countries. These free trade agreements are supposed to be beneficial. I'd like to just devote, this is the last thing I want to make, but I want to just make you think that this is, the validity of this proposition. Free trade agreements are supposed to be good because free trade is supposed to be good. Now, you see, if you take the world economy as a whole, the rate of growth of total world demand is something which is exogenously given. It's given by the amount of government expenditures that take place, added together, and so on and so forth. If it is exogenously given, then any country being successful in pushing its exports implies at the expense of some other country. In fact, during even the discussion of the Indo-US trade treaty, people have been wondering, are we going to be able to sell more at the expense of Bangladesh? In other words, if you are going to have export-led growth as a strategy of development, then that export-led growth would necessarily mean doing down some other country. This, I believe, is fundamentally unethical, fundamentally erroneous. Countries of the global south doing down one another in the quest for export-led growth is fundamentally erroneous. What is more, it's also, in my view, anti-democratic, because in order to push exports, you have to invite multinational corporations to set up plants in your country. That basically means you have to give them extraterritorial rights, that we are not going to tax you, you please come. And that means you have a situation where the jurisdiction of the elected government, which is elected by the people and therefore represents in some sense the will of the people, the jurisdiction of the elected government shrinks. So export-led growth is necessarily one that gives rise to a reduction in the extent of democracy in a particular country. It also gives rise to a division. Suppose there is one place where you have, let us say, successful exporting, some sector. You can't tax that sector because of the fact that you have promised the multinationals who have set up plants there that will not going to touch you. But at the same time, some other sector which cannot compete against cheap imports goes down. Therefore, you have the enormous increase in poverty at one place, which cannot be ameliorated by taxing the affluent or more prosperous sectors. So it gives rise to heightened inequalities, and it gives rise to even an increase in the level of absolute poverty. So this export-led growth as a strategy, which we started with the introduction of neoliberal policies, is something which has finally culminated in things like the Indo-US trade agreement, culminated in the Indo-EU FTA, Indo-UK FTA and so on. This entire strategy is something which is erroneous. Then you would ask, what is the alternative? A very well-known economist called Nicholas Kaldor had once drawn a distinction. He drew a distinction between industry growing by exporting to other countries, which is what we normally mean by export-led growth. Alternatively, industry can grow by exporting to agriculture, and that is internal export-led growth. So you raise the rate of growth of agriculture, that would then create purchasing power in the hands of the farmers. They would buy goods. Therefore, new goods would be produced, investment would take place, and therefore you'll have growth based on an internal export, which is basically a case of agriculture-led growth. Now, even though we may not have consciously theorized it in that way, basically the pre-neoliberal strategy in India was a strategy of agriculture-led growth or internal export-led growth. Certainly, the economy was protected. Protection was justified by virtue of the fact that the purchasing power in the hands of agriculture must not leak out abroad. This purchasing power must create demand for Indian goods, because that's the whole rationale of this entire development strategy. This is a development strategy where sectors generally grow in synchrony, in balance. Industry grows because agriculture is growing. There is no question of some sector growing and others languishing, but rather sectors grow in synchrony. It is, of course, a much more democratic development strategy, and it is a development strategy which is one where, is one which we willy-nilly, not necessarily theorizing it in that way, had been pursuing before. A protected home market-based, agriculture-led development strategy. Against this, the argument that would be put forward by many would be that, look, but on the other hand, we didn't have as high a growth rate in the old days, but now we have got such high growth rates that our growth rate is nearly doubled. Earlier we had only 4%, but now we have an 8% growth rate. Firstly, whether we actually have an 8% growth rate or not is very doubtful, because Arvind Subramaniam, who was the chief economic advisor to the government of India itself, had actually said that this growth rate is highly overestimated, and he said it's overestimated by almost 2.5% per annum, which basically means that if you take 7% as the current growth rate, take away 2.5 is about 4.5% growth rate, which is really no higher than what we had in the so-called bad old days before neoliberalism. But what is more, this is something, I mean, you know, that if you want a higher growth under a strategy of protected home market based agriculture led industrialization, then you have to increase the rate of growth of agriculture, for which you would require land reforms, for which you require all kinds of other measures, and that is the way to bring about an improvement in your growth performance. It is not necessary for you to open up your economy in order to improve your growth performance. Very important for you to improve your growth performance by undertaking appropriate reforms, appropriate investments and so on, with the state playing a major role. So it is not the only thing that is available to us. It is actually something which is pushed under a false argument. I'll tell you what the false argument is and then I'll stop. The false argument is the following. I'll tell you that this argument was put forward by none other than my own PhD supervisor. The false, and so I feel a bit odd saying it. I only give him the benefit of doubt, thinking that maybe he was not aware of the political implications of it. But anyway, the argument is the following, that I mentioned that one country's export success must be at the expense of another because the rate of growth of world demand is exogenously given. The argument that he put forward, they put forward, now all defenders of neoliberalism put forward, that argument says that no, the rate of growth of world demand is not given. At least even if it is given, it should not concern me. Why not? Because I am a small country. This is called a small country assumption. That a small country doesn't have to worry about doing down some other country because it's small. Therefore, the entire unethical nature of export-led growth was supposed to be suppressed by the small country assumption. But the small country assumption can be made literally for a small country, but you can't make it for every country. Because if you make it for every country, then the assumption becomes ridiculous. Therefore, it is actually the export-led growth strategy is being pushed under false premises. And today, unfortunately, a lot of people, newspapers, economic thinkers and so on, are really sold on this idea. But I thought that JNU students must be alerted to the dangers of this export-led growth. Thank you very much.